The Battle of Leipzig was a pivotal moment in the Napoleonic Wars. It is often called the Battle of Nations, for good reasons too. Many nations took part in this battle. To understand what happened and what led up to this battle, we need to look back at what happened the years prior to this battle. Napoleon's rise was made possible by the French Revolution, a time in France where the monarchy was threatened due to their corruption. The other nations in Europe saw what was happening in France and were scared that this revolutionary attitude would spread to their nation, so they were getting ready for war. But France beat them to it by declaring war on Austria. After many years of war, Napoleon defeated the coalition twice, once in 1797 in Italy, and the second time in 1800 and 1802. At this point, Napoleon was becoming very popular in France. The government was scared that he would overthrow them. Their suspicion was right, because Napoleon would crown himself Emperor of the French on December 2nd, 1804, in Notre Dame Cathedral. But his enemies were not just going to stand by and let Napoleon gain more and more power. This is where they tried to stop him. Multiple coalitions tried to stop him, but Napoleon embarrassed them all. Napoleon Bonaparte's empire dominated Europe by the early 1810s. France controlled or influenced much of continental Europe through conquest, alliances, and client states. Prussia had been crushed in 1806, Austria defeated multiple times, and Russia temporarily aligned with France after the Treaty of Tilsit in 1807. Napoleon's military reputation was unmatched, and many European rulers believed resistance was pointless. However, beneath the surface was dominance, resentment toward the French occupation, and exhaustion from endless warfare were steadily growing across Europe. The first major crack in Napoleon's system came with the Peninsular War in Spain and Portugal. When Napoleon expected to be a quick intervention turned into a brutal guerrilla war that tied down hundreds of thousands of French troops. British forces under the Duke of Wellington exploited this weakness, slowly pushing French armies out of the Iberian Peninsula. The Peninsular War drained French manpower, finances, and morale, while also proving that Napoleon could be resisted successfully on land. But Napoleon's true downfall came in 1812 when he tried to force Tsar Alexander I of Russia to comply with the Continental System, which was an economic blockade of British goods. Napoleon marched his army over 600,000 men deep into Russian territory. The Russians avoided decisive battle, scorched the countryside, and lured the French further east. Before Napoleon entered Moscow, he got the decisive battle he wanted for so long at Borodino. It was a bloodbath on both sides, one of the worst battles in terms of losses in the Napoleonic Wars. Before the Russians left, they burned Moscow. They destroyed supplies and destroyed the city. Moscow was the heart of the Russian Empire. Napoleon thought by taking this important city that Tsar Alexander must come to talk about peace terms. Unfortunately, he was wrong. No peace was offered. The retreat from Moscow during the Russian winter destroyed the army, leaving Napoleon's empire military vulnerable for the first time. Out of roughly 600,000 troops that entered Russia, fewer than 100,000 returned. His former enemies Prussia and Austria saw this defeat and took the opportunity for revenge. Prussia broke its forced alliance with France in 1813. French troops had been stationed in Prussia since the defeat in 1806, effectively occupying the country, extracting men, supplies, and money. After the Russian disaster, these garrisons found themselves isolated and hated by the local population. Prussian officers such as Gerhard von Schatzhorst and Augustus von Gneisenau seized the moment in early 1813. Prussia openly defected from Napoleon. French garrisons were attacked, cut off, or forced to retreat westward. Many surrendered outright due to lack of supplies and reinforcements. Others were absorbed into hastily assembled French field armies, composed largely of inexperienced teenage conscripts. While in Austria, the situation was more complicated. Austria had been Napoleon's ally since defeat in 1809, bound to France by treaty and by Napoleon's marriage to the Archduchess Marie Louise. Austrian troops had participated in Russia's campaign but had deliberately avoided heavy fighting, preserving their strength. After the catastrophe, Austria adopted a position of cautious neutrality. French forces on Austrian territory were allowed to withdraw, but were closely watched and diplomatically isolated. Austria used this time to rebuild its army while positioning itself as a mediator, but in reality it was preparing to join Napoleon's enemies when the opportunity opened itself. This would be known as the War of the Sixth Coalition. Russia, Prussia, Britain, Austria, Sweden, and several German states united against Napoleon. Nationalist sentiment surged, particularly in German lands where resentment toward French domination had been growing for years. Austria was initially cautious, but eventually joined the coalition after failed negotiations with Napoleon, tipping the balance decisively against him. It seems that once he had controlled all of Europe, and now it was him against all of Europe. But for most of Napoleon's career, the odds were almost always against him. So this was nothing new. He was still one of the best commanders in the history of war. Throughout 1813, Napoleon fought a series of battles in Germany, winning several tactical victories but failing to achieve a decisive knockout win. His armies were increasingly composed of young, inexperienced conscripts, lacking the veteran experience that was destroyed in Russia. Meanwhile, coalition forces adopted a strategy of avoiding Napoleon himself while attacking his marshals and cutting his supply lines. This campaign of attrition forced Napoleon to concentrate his forces around the key city of Leipzig, a major communication hub in Saxony. The coalition knew they couldn't attack Napoleon head-on in a big battle. Every time Napoleon tried to engage them in battle, they would back away, and anywhere he wasn't, they would attack. In January 1813, Russian armies under Field Marshal Mikhail Kutuzov crossed into eastern Prussia, liberating Königsberg and pushing westward almost unopposed. The myth of French dominance was gone. On 28 February 1813, Prussia formally abandoned Napoleon by signing the Treaty of Kalisz with Russia. King Frederick Wilhelm III of Prussia issued a call to arms, igniting the War of Liberation. Prussian generals such as Blücher and Scharnhorst reorganized the army, introducing mass conscription, and mobilized nationalistic sentiment. Napoleon responded with incredible speed. By April 1813, he had raised a new army of over 300,000 men, many of them young conscripts. However, this army lacked experienced cavalry, something Napoleon would suffer later down the campaign. Napoleon personally took command in Germany, establishing his headquarters in Erfurt and advancing into Saxony, which remained loyal to France. On 2 May 1813, he defeated Russo-Prussian forces at the Battle of Lutzen near Leipzig against Generals Wellington and Blücher. Though tactically successful, the battle failed to destroy the main enemy army. The coalition withdrew intact with their army. One of the reasons why he couldn't finish off a defeated army was the lack of cavalry, which meant he could not pursue or exploit victories. Napoleon knew that he needed more time. A way for him to do this was the armistice of Platzwitz, halting operations for nearly 2 months. This pause proved disastrous for France. While Napoleon hoped to negotiate from a position of strength, the coalition used the time to expand, reorganize for a better and stronger offensive. On the 23rd of August, 1813, French Marshal MacDonald was defeated by Blücher at the Battle of Katzbach in Silesia. 2 days later, Marshal Oudinot was beaten at Grossbeeren, south of Berlin, by Prussian forces under Ritter Wilhelm von Bülow. A second attempt to take Berlin failed in September, when Marshal Ney was defeated at Dennwitz. This strategy of attacking Napoleon's marshals was paying off, but some good news came in the south. Napoleon scored a major victory at Dresden against Schwarzenberg's main army, but this success was short-lived. As Napoleon pursued, his generals were defeated again. Many German states, seeing what was happening to Napoleon's army, were now changing sides. Bavaria switched sides in October, and the Confederation of the Rhine began to collapse, isolating Napoleon in Saxony, making a bad situation even worse. By early October, Napoleon was trapped. Coalition armies were advancing from every direction. Napoleon concentrated his forces around Leipzig, a vital road and river junction. His army numbered around 190,000 strong, facing over 300,000 coalition troops, the largest concentration of armies Europe had ever seen. Napoleon picked Leipzig, where he would face the combined forces of the Sixth Coalition. The battle lasted 4 days. On the first day, Napoleon attempted a decisive blow against Schwarzenberg's Austrian army before Blücher and Bernadotte could arrive. Napoleon launched a massive artillery concentration, over 150 guns, followed by a cavalry charge led by Murat, nearly breaking the coalition center. Unfortunately, the horses became tired just as reinforcements came to stop their advance. Another problem with Napoleon being outnumbered was he didn't have the luxury of sending reinforcements because he was being pinned on all fronts, with a limited amount of manpower he could use. While Napoleon fought in the south, Blücher attacked in the north, near Macheren. After brutal street fighting, Marshal Marmont was driven back. This was the end of day 1 of the battle. Napoleon failed to destroy Schwarzenberg before the other armies of the coalitions could arrive, and even worse, Blücher gained ground north of Leipzig, threatening the French retreat. On the second day, not much happened due to the heavy fighting on the first day. Both armies were tired, but more coalition reinforcements arrived. Bernadotte from the north, Bennigsen from the east. Napoleon realized that he had no longer had the upper hand in this battle, so he began preparing withdrawal routes west. On the third day of the battle, the coalition army attacked from every direction. During fighting near Protzendorf, Saxon troops, formerly Napoleon's allies, switched sides mid-battle, turning their guns on the French. This created a hole in Napoleon's line, which had to be plugged by more cavalry. This shattered French morale, and the army was moving more towards the city of Leipzig. When the day ended, reaching nightfall, Napoleon ordered a general retreat to begin next morning. Leipzig would be abandoned. On the fourth day, the coalition moved towards the city, mostly without any resistance from the French, since most of the army was within the city. A problem with the retreating plan was that there was only one bridge leading across the Elster River. Napoleon had engineers, but no one made plans to build multiple bridges. That way the army could leave more effectively. This single bridge would become a problem when the city fell. It would become a chokehold because not enough people could get across in a short amount of time. But as the coalition forces approached the bridge, French engineers detonated the bridge. Thousands of soldiers were trapped on the wrong side. Marshal Poniatowski was wounded multiple times and drowned trying to escape. The coalition forces entered Leipzig by midday, a major win for them. At the end of the battle, total casualties ranged from the French being around 70,000 killed, wounded, or captured, and 400 guns lost, and casualties from the coalition ranged around 55,000 casualties. The effect of the aftermath of this battle was it shattered Napoleon's bargaining power. Before the battle, Austria and even some German states still considered the possibility of a negotiating peace with Napoleon on the throne. After Leipzig, those hopes vanished. The Sixth Coalition no longer needed compromises. They could dictate terms as they wanted. Napoleon was now viewed as not a stabilizing force, but a liability to European order, and now the coalition was not going to give up because they had put too much into this war. Napoleon had always built his authority on victory, which is good because victory is a position of strength. His officers and soldiers believed in him because he always found a way to win. Leipzig was the first time he was outnumbered, surrounded, and ultimately forced to retreat, not because of a single mistake, but because Europe itself had turned against him, and he had only a limited number of resources, which didn't help his situation. Leipzig completed the destruction of his Grand Army as a professional veteran fighting force. The army Napoleon led in 1813 was already weakened by the Russian campaign, but Leipzig destroyed what remained of its experienced corps. Tens of thousands of seasoned officers were killed or captured. Many elite divisions were also killed or captured, whereas his enemies were only getting more experience. After Leipzig, Napoleon no longer had an army capable of sustained offensive operations. What remained was a defensive force, forced to fight on French soil. Before Leipzig, many soldiers still believed Napoleon could save the empire. After the battle, faith gave way to exhaustion. Soldiers understood that France was now alone, facing the combined might of Europe. Equally damaging was the collapse of Allied loyalty. The Saxon desertion during the battle symbolized a wider truth. Napoleon's empire had been held together by fear and success. Once success vanished, so did loyalty, at least for the foreign divisions. The defeat at Leipzig meant he lost Germany. You might be asking, why is losing Germany important to Napoleon? Well, for one, he had many French garrisons in cities such as Hamburg, Mertenburg, Danzig, were also isolated and besieged. He lost over 100,000 soldiers locked inside fortresses. If Napoleon won this battle, then he could have released the troops that were being besieged, and losing experienced soldiers was something Napoleon could no longer afford. With the loss of Germany, the Rhine was now the last natural defensive border between France and the Sixth Coalition. Another aspect of losing the battle was Napoleon's authority at home. With the loss, the French state began questioning his leadership and his laws, because once the war became longer, conscription became harsher and more unpopular, which hurt Napoleon's trust among the people and the Senate, which he needed if he wanted to win this war. But even after the horrible defeat, there was still hope because in November 1813, the Sixth Coalition offered peace terms in Frankfurt. After Napoleon's defeat, the coalition did not immediately seek his overthrow. Instead, Austria, led by Metternich, pushed for a compromise peace designed to stabilize Europe without completely humiliating France. The condition of this peace was that Napoleon could remain emperor of the French, and France would have to return to its natural frontier before the start of the war. The offer was driven mainly by Austria, not Britain or Prussia. Each country had its own war goal. Austria didn't want one superpower in Europe. Instead, they wanted Napoleon as a way to balance power among the other nations like Russia and Britain. But Britain was more harsh and wanted to depose Napoleon. Napoleon never formally accepted or declined the Frankfurt proposal. He just stated that he was willing to keep negotiations open. Unfortunately for Napoleon, he didn't have the hindsight that we have in the future, because this peace deal was the only good deal he was going to get. If he didn't accept this deal, then it was all or nothing. In Napoleon's mind, the loss of Leipzig was a setback, not a total defeat. One of the reasons why Napoleon didn't immediately accept the peace offer was he suspected the offer was vague and irreversible. He feared that once he agreed, the coalition would demand further concessions and eventually just depose him anyway. But for Napoleon, he believed in his own ability as a skilled military commander and a leader, and for most of his career, he was the underdog. But Leipzig was a nail in the coffin for Napoleon. After the battle, it was only a matter of time, and once the coalition crossed over the Rhine into France, unfortunately for Napoleon, there would be no more compromises. Thank you for watching until the end. If you enjoy this type of content, leave some comments about this topic down below. Do you think Napoleon should have accepted the Frankfurt proposal? Do you think he could have made a comeback and defeated the Sixth Coalition?